Hi guys, welcome to your lesson on operant conditioning. So we are continuing our lessons in our unit of learning, and operant conditioning is a type of learning in which a behavior becomes more likely to recur if it's followed by a reinforcer, or if it's less likely to occur if followed by some kind of punisher. So quick comparison. We definitely defined operant conditioning in the last lesson, but we focused on classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is when organisms form associations between stimuli, so a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. And then classical conditioning also involves respondent behavior, so automatic responses to a stimulus. Whereas operant conditioning, organisms associate their own actions with consequences. So behavior that operates on the environment to produce rewarding or punishing stimuli is called operant behavior. AP exam tip number 1, you may have to differentiate classical conditioning and operant conditioning on the AP exam. So a good way to remember this is classical conditioning is involuntary, respondent behavior, while operant conditioning is voluntary, operant behavior. So we have a key figure in this. We're going to spend some time on him. Classical conditioning, we had Pavlov, and we also talked about Watson with the little baby Albert. And now operant, we're talking about B.F. Skinner. Skinner was behaviorism's most influential and controversial figure. And one way that you can remember Skinner and behaviorism is B.F. Skinner, behaviorism Skinner. His work elaborated on what psychologist Edward Thorndike called the law of effect. Thorndike used a fish reward to entice cats to find their way out of a puzzle box through a series of maneuvers. So, the law of effect is Thorndike's principle that behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely, and that behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. That's pretty obvious, right? The cat's performance tended to improve with successive trials, illustrating Thorndike's law of effect. So the more that it was able to escape through those and maneuver through the puzzle box, it got fish. So Skinner designed something called an operant chamber, which is also known as Skinner's box. So what is an operant chamber? An operant chamber research In operant conditioning research, a chamber, also known as a Skinner box, contains a bar or key that an animal can manipulate to obtain a food or water reinforcer. Attached devices record the animal's rate of bar pressing or key pecking. So, how does it operate? Well, inside the box, the rat presses a bar for a food reward. Outside, measuring devices, not shown in this picture, record the animal's accumulated responses. The Skinner box creates a stage on which rats and other animals act out Skinner's concept of reinforcement. Reinforcement is any event that strengthens or increases the frequency of a preceding response. So, what is reinforcing depends on the animal and the conditions. For people, it might be praise, attention, a paycheck. For hungry and thirsty rats, then food and water would work well. Are all reinforcers created equal? Well, no. Based on what I just said in the last slide, what is reinforcing to one animal may not be to another. So a heat lamp, a meerkat might really like the heat lamp, whereas an overheated child is definitely not going to want a heat lamp to enforce good behavior. So what makes a reinforcer a reinforcer? It's important to note that a reinforcer is defined by its impact on behavior. A reinforcer increases the likelihood that the behavior will increase. So ice cream may sound like it's a reinforcer for all, but what if the subject is lactose intolerant? How is behavior shaped through operant conditioning? So another psychoblurb is shaping. Shaping is an operant conditioning procedure in which reinforcement guides behavior toward closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. This is also called reward by successive approximations. Basically, what that means is over and over, operant conditioning that's repeated, you're going to eventually shape the behavior that's desired or create. How would Skinner shape a rat's behavior to press a bar to get food? First, researchers watch how the animal naturally behaves to build on its existing behaviors. Then the rat would be given a bit of food, which is the reinforcement, each time it approaches the bar. Then once the rat is approaching regularly, food would only be given when it moves close to the bar. Then closer still. Finally, experiments would require the rat to actually touch the bar to get food. So this would mean that they are shaping the rat's behavior in order to get it to press the bar to get food. What is a discriminative stimulus? So we talked about this in the last lesson, and it was part of your explore work as well. A stimulus that elicits a response after association with reinforcement. So this is in contrast to related stimuli not associated with reinforcement. So Skinner might train a pigeon to peck at a green circle, the descriptive stimulus, but not a red square. Discriminative. How have pigeons learned to discriminate? Well, after being reinforced with food correctly spotting breast tumors, pigeons became as skilled as humans at discriminating cancerous from healthy tissue, which is really awesome. So remember, discriminating means to be able to tell the difference between, not used in the term that we might know it socially. So let's look at the research on discriminative stimulus training in animals. Dogs have been shaped to sniff out landmines or locate people amid rubble, right? They can distinguish between the smells. After being trained to discriminate among classes of events or objects, flowers, people, cars, chairs, pigeons can usually identify the category in which a new pictured object belongs. Pigeons have even been trained to discriminate between the music of Bach and Stravinsky, which is crazy awesome because that's classical music. What's positive reinforcement? So we're moving into some new terms that we did not do when we were studying classical conditioning. Positive reinforcement is increasing behaviors by presenting positive reinforcers. A positive reinforcement is any stimulus that, when presented after a response, strengthens the response. Whereas a negative reinforcement increases behaviors by stopping or reducing aversive stimuli. So a negative reinforcement is any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response. This is a very easily confused term. Very easily confused term on the AP Psych exam. So the word aversive means causing strong dislike or disinclination. So causing strong dislike. So if we are increasing behaviors by stopping or reducing strong dislike. Sorry, I had to pause that for a minute. The phone was ringing and I didn't want it to interrupt our video because I'm making this at school. So I needed to answer that. Okay, so negative reinforcement, any stimulus that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response. So why it's called negative reinforcement is because you're taking the stimulus away, and as you take it away, it strengthens the response. So what are examples of positive and negative reinforcement? Positive reinforcement, studying hard, that's the behavior. So you're always going to look for the behavior when you're looking for reinforcements, when you're looking to identify. So studying hard is the behavior, and receiving an A is the reinforcement. Arriving at work on time is the behavior. Receiving praise or an actual raise is the reinforcement. So that's easy to understand. Positive is easy. Negative, take an aspirin, is the behavior. Reduces the painful headache. That's the removal of the stimulus that causes a strong dislike, aversive. So aversive, strong dislike is the headache. So negative reinforcement is where you have a behavior You're doing something and it reduces the other thing that you don't like. Hitting the snooze button is the behavior, and that shuts off an annoying alarm. Exam tip: negative reinforcement is not a punishment. It's very easily misunderstood that it is a punishment. It is not. Negative reinforcement is psychology's most misunderstood concept. It means it removes a punishing aversive event. It is not a punishment. So think of negative reinforcement as something that provides relief from that whining teenager, bad headache, or annoying seatbelt alarm. No teenagers are ever whiny, though. All right, so what are primary and conditioned secondary reinforcers? Conditioned and secondary mean the same thing. So primary reinforcers are innately reinforcing stimuli, such as those that satisfy a biological need: food, pain relief. Secondary or conditioned reinforcers are stimuli that gain their reinforcing power through their learned association with the primary reinforcer. So examples are money, good grades, a pleasant tone of voice. So these are, again, stimuli that gain reinforcing power through their association with some kind of primary reinforcer. How does the immediacy of the reinforcement impact behavior? So some animals will need immediate, meaning within about 30 seconds, reinforcement in order to tie the reinforcement to the behavior. This is really cool. This is how animals and humans learn. Human animals respond to delayed reinforcement, even learn to delay gratification as a point of maturity. Examples of delayed gratification: paycheck that comes at the end of the month, or like us teachers, we get paid once a month. The trophy that comes at the end of the season, the good grade that comes at the end of the year. These are all types of examples of delayed gratification. What are reinforcement schedules? All right, so this is a new chunk of the lesson. So there's types of reinforcement, positive and negative, and then we're getting into reinforcement schedules, which are patterns that define how often a desired response will be reinforced. Do you guys hear the hand dryer? It's so loud still. Two types of reinforcement schedules are continuous and partial. Partial meaning intermittent. So they are just what they sound like. Reinforcing the desired response every time it occurs is continuous, whereas partial or intermittent is reinforcing a response only part of the time. How does continuous reinforcement impact learning? Well, with continuous reinforcement, learning occurs rapidly, so it's the best choice for learning a behavior. Extinction also occurs rapidly, so when continuous reinforcement stops, the behavior soon stops or is extinguished. If a normally dependable candy machine fails to deliver a chocolate bar twice in a row, we're going to stop putting money into it. Although a week later, we may exhibit a spontaneous recovery by trying again. So this is cool because we just reviewed some of the psychoblurbs that we talked about in classical conditioning. So how does partial or intermittent reinforcement impact learning? Well, real life very rarely provides continuous reinforcement, right? So salespeople, for example, don't make a sale with every single pitch, but they persist, and because their efforts are occasionally rewarded, they continue. So this persistence is typical with partial or intermittent reinforcement schedules, in which responses are sometimes reinforced, but sometimes not. Learning is slower to appear, but resistance to extinction is greater than with continuous reinforcement. In other words, you're going to have less extinction with partial reinforcement schedules. So partial reinforcement also works with children. Occasionally giving in to children's tantrums for the sake of peace and quiet intermittently reinforces the tantrums. And any of you who have younger brothers or sisters, you know that you've seen this happen. Everybody has given in to a kid's tantrum at some point just to make the kid be quiet or whatever. If you're in a restaurant or I don't know, tons of different situations. Well, doing that, the child learns that if I act badly, then I'm going to get what I want. That's what giving in means. So this is the very best way for making a behavior persist, whether it's a good behavior or a not so desirable behavior. So there are 4 types of partial reinforcement, and this we will do lots of practice with. And they're not that hard to understand. It's just a lot of new terms, so don't stress out. They're new terms that you know the meaning of. You know what fixed means, right? You know what variable means. It means it changes. So let's look at these definitions. So fixed ratio schedules, that's when reinforcement occurs after a set number of responses. Fixed interval schedules, where reinforcement occurs after a set length of time. So the only difference between the two, between ratio and interval, is that with ratio, you're dealing with a number of responses, and with interval, you're dealing with a set length of time. Variable ratio schedules, that is when reinforcement occurs after an unpredictable number of responses. So if we're comparing variable and fixed, fixed is a set number and variable is an unpredictable number. We're still dealing with responses when we're dealing with ratio. So you can remember ratio responses both start with an R. Fixed interval schedules and variable interval schedules both deal with a length of time. Interval ends with an L, which can remind you of length, and we're dealing with time. Interval also has a T in it, which can help you remember time. So examples of the 4 types of partial reinforcement. So we've got fixed ratio. We've got 1 free cup of coffee after every 10 purchased. And we have, for variable, we've got payoff on a slot machine after a varying number of plays. You don't know when you're going to get paid off. It varies. For fixed interval, mail arriving at 2 o'clock every day. And for variable interval, checking our phone for a text from our friend. Exam tip number 3. Students sometimes have difficulty with the schedules of reinforcement. The word interval in schedules of reinforcement means that an interval of time must pass before reinforcement. There's nothing the learner can do to shorten the interval. The word ratio refers to the ratio of responses to reinforcements. If the learner responds with greater frequency, there will be more reinforcements. So moving into the last part of the lesson, what is punishment and how is it different from negative reinforcement? Punishment is an event that tends to decrease the behavior it follows. So behavior that's punished is less likely to occur again. Punishment adds an aversive stimulus, so something that's not desirable, or removes a pleasant stimulus in order to make it not desirable. So negative reinforcement increases the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. Negative reinforcement removes an aversive stimulus. So punishment tells you what not to do. Reinforcement tells you what to do. All right, so let that sink in for a minute. Punishment tells you what not to do. Reinforcement tells you what to do. So what are 2 ways to punish unwanted behavior? There's positive punishment and there's negative punishment. Positive punishment administers an aversive stimulus. So you spray water on a barking dog, you get a traffic ticket for speeding. Those are positive punishments where you give a stimulus that is not desirable. You're giving, okay? You're giving, even though it's not positive, you're giving something. Negative is when you take away something that's good. So taking away a misbehaving teen's driving privileges or cell phone use. Ooh, scary. Revoking a rude person's chat room access. There's lots of things that you can think about when you take away. That's a negative punishment. Positive punishment adds something negative, and negative punishment takes away something positive. 4 major drawbacks to the use of physical punishment. Punished behavior is suppressed, not forgotten. This temporary state may negatively reinforce parents' punishing behavior. Punishment teaches discrimination among situations. Punishment can teach fear, and physical punishment may increase aggression by modeling violence as a way to cope with problems. So why did Skinner's legacy provoke controversy? So going back to the beginning of B.F. Skinner, B.F. are his initials, and remember I said B could stand for behavioral to help you remember what he's associated with. Critics of Skinner's principles believe the approach dehumanized people by neglecting their personal freedom and seeking to control their actions. Skinner replied that people's actions are already controlled by external consequences, and that reinforcement is more humane than punishment as a means for controlling behavior. So, to wrap it up, how can operant conditioning...
Good afternoon.
Oh, hold on. Okay, I'm back. All right, so wrapping it up with operant conditioning techniques and real life. So how can these be applied at school, sports, work, home, self-improvement to manage stress? School online quizzing allows for immediate feedback. Students receive reinforcement for correct understanding. That's an example of operant conditioning. Sports, the key to shaping behavior and athletic performance as elsewhere is reinforcing small successes and then gradually increasing the challenge. How do operant conditioning principles underlie superstitions? Well, if a baseball or softball player gets hit, which is reinforcement after tapping the plate with a bat, voluntary behavior, he or she may be more likely to do so again. Over time, the player may experience partial reinforcement for what becomes a superstitious behavior. Work rewards are most likely to increase productivity if the desired performance is both well-defined and achievable. Parenting, when parents say, get ready for bed, and then cave in to protests or defiance, the child's whining and arguing are being reinforced. So here on the right are some operant parenting tips. Give kids attention and other reinforcement when they are behaving well so that they continue those good behaviors. Target a specific behavior, reinforce it, and watch it increase. When kids misbehave or are defiant, don't yell at them or hit them. Explain the misbehavior and punish it by taking away the iPad, removing a misused toy, or by giving a brief timeout. Self-improvement. To build up your self-control, you need to reinforce your own desired behaviors and extinguish the undesired ones. This is so cool because this is how we change and grow as people. 5 steps. Set a realistic goal in measurable terms and announce it. Decide how and when and where you'll work towards your goal. Monitor how often you engage in your desired behavior. Reinforce the desired behavior and reduce the rewards gradually. Managing stress. There's some evidence that when we have feedback about our bodily responses, we can sometimes change those responses. There's a researcher, Neil Miller, working with biofeedback, found that rats could modify their heartbeat if given pleasurable brain stimulation when their heartbeat increased or decreased. Later research revealed that some paralyzed humans could also learn to control their blood pressure. What is biofeedback? The biofeedback systems such as this one record tension in the forehead muscle of a headache sufferer and allow people to monitor their subtle physiological responses. So this chart's in your notes. How are classical and operant conditioning similar and different? So we've got vocab words in there with the basic idea, the response, acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. So the important thing to know is both classical and operant conditioning are forms of associative learning, where we learn associations between events that we don't control with classical, and we learn associations between our behavior and its consequences with operant. So both are types of associations. I hope this was a great lesson, and I can't wait to see you next class. Ciao, ciao.